A new Hollywood hit, The Woman King, has recently been released. Now, it's about an army of female African warriors in the 1800s. Now, if you haven't seen it, don't worry, there won't be any spoilers in this video. Or at least I don't think so. I haven't seen it myself. But this video is not about the film. Now, for those who don't know, The Woman King took inspiration from a period in West African history, and that is what we're going to be focusing on. So what was the Dahomey Kingdom and who exactly were the Agojie? Now, the Kingdom of Dahomey would have existed around the 1600s and officially came to an end in 1904. The area in question is what is now modern day Benin, the southern region to be precise, and this ultimately included the conquering of two very prominent kingdoms, Alada and Ouida, in the early 1700s, essentially encompassing the coastline. And this will be a very important detail in just a bit. Now, very little is actually known about the origins of the Agojie, but it's thought that they were initially organized into groups of elephant hunters, or ghezo, by the then King Agojie, ruling from 1645 to 1685. Now, they were then later organized into military units around 1729 in order for the Dahomey army to be bigger and more imposing in battle. There were probably a number of different incarnations of the Agojie. As I said, most likely formed as groups of elephant hunters, and they would later be deployed as female bodyguards during the reign of King Agojie's daughter, Queen Hangbi. She was then succeeded by her brother King Agojie, who supposedly utilized the Agojie in battle against the neighboring Savi kingdom. And importantly, Agojie would be the man to defeat Alada in 1724 and Ouida 3 years later in 1727. The kingdom of Dahomey was now expanded to the coast, which gave them control over the Atlantic slave trade routes. There isn't really a consensus on why Agojie decided to make this move. Some historians believe that he had no choice and resisted the move, but that ultimately he needed to protect his kingdom. Others suggest that he was simply acting out of economic interest. Over the next few decades, Dahomey would carry out continuous slave raids, essentially kidnapping people from neighboring communities to be sold, particularly to Portuguese slave traders. This would provide up to 20% of the total slaves and was the biggest source of income for the kingdom. Now, if we move ahead to 1818 and the rule of King Ghezo, this is when things really go up a notch. King Ghezo had forcibly removed his brother from power with the help of a man located in Ouida by the name of Francisco Felix de Souza. De Souza was a Brazilian slave trader, and it was his financial backing and military assistance which allowed Ghezo to come to such a position of power. As with most political favours, it was returned with an honour. In this case, De Souza, the slave trader, was made the Viceroy of Trade for the Dahomey Kingdom. Incidentally, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the 40-year reign of King Ghezo from 1818 to 1858 is also when we see the real militarization of the Agojie. Existing in various forms beforehand, and of course experiencing battle, the role of the Agojie in society had been largely ceremonial. Ghezo would change this, seeing it as an important part in the strength of the kingdom. Of course, they would be involved in many of the slave raids from which the kingdom of Dahomey would continue to thrive. Now, there are many ways in which women and sadly young girls were recruited as Agojie. Initially, the recruitment process was seen as a punishment for criminals, as an alternative to execution. But the skill of these warriors became so impressive that King Ghezo took notice and would order all families to provide him with their daughters, with a select few being chosen for military service. Some of the girls recruited would have been as young as 8 years old. Of the women, it's thought that some were recruited voluntarily, whilst others would have been given no choice. If their husbands or dads complained to the king about their behaviour, they would quickly be enrolled into the army. And in their service to the king, they would technically now be married to him. In fact, one of the names given to the women was ahosi, meaning wives of the king. Alternatively, the male warriors referred to them as mino, meaning our mothers. As you can imagine, life as an Agojie was quite isolated. In being married to the king, they were forbidden from any relationships outside and weren't allowed to have any children whilst serving. Upon being enrolled, all women were subject to the barbaric practice of FGM, and any aggression which would have been deemed undesirable in society was focused and controlled for the benefits of war. Whilst being well respected with a high standing in society, the the sacrifices required seemed to have stripped them of all humanity. They were feared for their ability to withstand pain and survive in the most grueling wartime environments. To all intents and purposes, they were almost seen like robots. Now, throughout its existence, the Dahomey kingdom posed a constant threat to the neighbouring kingdoms, with their army, including the Agojie's, constant invasions and captures of their citizens, obviously for the purposes of selling into slavery. Now, the early to mid 1800s was a very interesting period in Dahomey history. After all these years of ransacking cities and capturing citizens, the very well-defended neighbouring state of Abeokuta was established in 1825 and provided people with significant protection against Dahomey slave raids. Now, this caused a divide within the Dahomey military. The males generally tended to support an all-out war against Abeokuta, with the Agojie favouring the idea of raiding much smaller communities that would give a higher chance of success. In 1844, the decision was made. Dahomey would launch an assault on Abeokuta, and Dahomey would lose. Now, this coincided with a lot of political instability for the kingdom. In the 1840s, the British, who had recently ended their own involvement in the slave trade, were attempting to convince King Ghezo to do the same. Clearly, what with the advancement on Abeokuta, Ghezo had no interest in this, and he had the support of a lot of powerful and influential people at the time, including obviously the likes of senior slave traders and political leaders. But there was a faction who did support the idea of abandoning the slave trade, and that faction included the Agojie. The idea was that Dahomey would be able to build strong trade relations with the British through the export of palm oil rather than slaves. Palm oil, of course, being the driving force in Britain's industrialization. These factions became known as the Elephant and the Fly, with the elephant being Ghezo and his supporters, and the fly being the opposition. Ghezo was killed in 1859, most likely by a sniper from Abeokuta, but not before eventually signing a treaty with the British in 1852 to end the export of slaves from Dahomey. Although, having said that, the political state that Dahomey was in led them back into the slave trade in the late 1850s, of course with Ghezo's assassination coming in 1859. After another war with and another defeat to Abeokuta in the 1860s, the slave trade in Dahomey was significantly dwindling, and palm oil had now become far more favourable. So eventually, like all of Africa, Dahomey was subject to European colonisation, but not without a fight. There were two Franco-Dahomeyan wars in the late 19th century, and the Agojie were part of a couple of significant battles. Firstly, the Battle of Cotonou. The Agojie stormed the French lines, and it's said that they handled admirably in hand-to-hand combat. And the French soldiers themselves later wrote of the incredible courage and audacity of the Agojie. Despite this, the defeat was significant, with a reported 129 Dahomey deaths, including many Agojie. And in a later battle at Adagon, the Agojie would be comprehensively defeated, losing 417 personnel after the French charged at them with bayonets. And this would pretty much bring the independent kingdom of Dahomey to an end. So the kingdom of Dahomey and the Agojie seem to have had a very controversial existence, largely due to their apparent willingness to be involved in the slave trade. And it's important that stories like this are told to give a much clearer and better understanding of the realities of history. And if you're new to the channel and you enjoyed this, then there's plenty of other videos that I know you're gonna love. And you might want to start with the one on the screen now, and I'll see you over there.